Good evening, Mayor and Council. Mayor Ramirez, Housing Director. We're before you to introduce the final ordinances for just cause eviction, tenant protection, as well as the rent stabilization ordinance that we've been before you several times in the past. Those previous meetings included a lot of public comment and then presentations from staff to the Community Services Public Safety Housing Development Committee in September, and then to City Council in October and February. The committee heard the public and asked that staff present draft ordinances for council consideration in 2022, which we did in February, at which time council gave direction to the staff on several changes and then to bring back for introduction and adoption. The council asked that we consider the following changes in relative to the just cause tenant protection to make the relocation benefits equal to 2 months or $5,000, whichever is greater. Relative to the rent stabilization, make the rental adjustment limitation to be 5%, make both ordinances expire in December of 2030, and then allow for a petition for fair rate of return in the rent stabilization, which shall have been determined by the city manager versus a rent board. We also took additional stakeholder input since that date, and we made a few changes that were not inconsistent with the city council direction, including the definitions of owner and tenancy, including modifying the rent stabilization ordinance requiring the city manager to send fair rate of return petition to the owners and the tenants, not just to the owners. Staff also removed that list from the city manager consideration as part of the fair rate of return, and the rent is lawfully charged for comparable residential property as mobile home spaces is part of the consideration, and that any existing written lease lawfully entered in between the owner and the affected tenants also have been removed. We also reestablished the written notices provided pursuant to the requirement to be provided prescribed by the city. Clarified that the fee to be paid by rent stabilization will be paid by the owners. And we also considered a variety of requested changes from stakeholders, some of which were not incorporated. One of the things was that the local ordinances are more restrictive than the state Tenant Protection Act. And in fact, that is the case. It has to be more restrictive in order for it to be permitted to be applied locally. One instance is that the local ordinance triggers tenant protections after 30 days of tenancy versus 12 months of tenancy in the Tenant Protection Act. Some of the salient points in the just cause eviction tenant protection ordinance is, number one, it is more protective than the state law, where 1482 includes tenant protection and rent control in the single ordinance, therefore restricted to the same units per Costa-Hawkins. In this case, they're separate, so more units apply. It requires the landlord to pay relocation benefits of up to $5,000 or 2 months, which is more than 1482. Requires written notice for no-fault termination, including disclosure of relocation benefits. Imposes a tenant protection fee to cover the cost of implementing the program, and sunsets at December 2030. The rent stabilization ordinance includes that the rent control regulations apply to the same tenants occupied properties as described in the State Tenant Protection Act, largely because of Costa-Hawkins, and it limits the annual rent increase to once per year for an amount not to exceed 5% during that 12-month period. It allows the base rent to be set after a tenant turnover, requires written notice of rent increase, allows a landlord to appeal the rental increase limitation per the fair rate of return allowance that we discussed, and impose a rent stabilization fee to be covered for the cost of the program. Sunsets in December 2030. Enforcement is going to be complaint-based. The City Council directed staff to stand up a program for education training. Such a program will include, has not been designed yet, but will include bilingual marketing, printed electronic materials, education and outreach, a web presence, and other forms of outreach. Financial impact at full burden, we expect that the program would cost approximately $1.2 million annually. That is a ramp up to that level, which could include 6 positions. As you can see on screen, a program manager, office support staff, compliance officer, staff within the city attorney's office. Each ordinance includes an imposition of an annual fee, which is intended to cover that cost, but it's going to be a ramp up, and we're not going to set that at the beginning. So in first year of operations, 22-23, we're asking for a $300,000 allocation from the general fund to cover the initial first staff of ramping up and initial marketing, education, public outreach. So our recommendation is that the city council introduce for first reading by title only and waive further readings of an ordinance adding Article 1, Chapter 27 to the Oxnard City Code, which is entitled an ordinance of the City Council of the City of Oxnard, adding Article 1 to Chapter 27 of the Oxnard City Code, establishing just cause evictions and other tenant protections. And 2, introduce for first reading by title only and waiving further reading of an ordinance, adding Article 2, Chapter 27 of the Oxnard City Code, that is entitled an ordinance of the City Council of the City of Oxnard, adding Article 2 to Chapter 27 of the Oxnard City Code, establishing rent stabilization regulations, including prohibiting residential real property rental rate increases that exceed 5% annually. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.